My mother was rinsing a coffee mug when she said it. Not turning around, not pausing, just watching the water run over the rim like the words cost her nothing. Your sister's family has to come first. You understand that. You always have more room to give. I was standing in the doorway of my parents' kitchen, holding a grocery bag I'd picked up on the way over. Bread. The brand my mother liked. Orange juice because my father's doctor had mentioned vitamin C at his last checkup. I stood there with the bag going soft in my grip, and I thought, there it is. Not the first time I'd felt that thought. The first time I'd heard the sentence spoken out loud. I said, okay. I set the groceries on the counter. I drove home. That was the moment something in me finally stopped waiting. My sister is 3 years older than me, which I used to think meant we had the same parents. We did not. We had the same address, the same last name, the same dining room table on Sunday evenings, but the house we grew up in ran on a different set of rules depending on which of us walked into the room. She was the first grandchild on both sides. I understood early that a thing doesn't have to be spoken to be true. It lived in small gestures, the kind that accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed, invisible until you finally look down. When my sister got her driver's license, my father took a half day off work to drive her to the DMV. He brought her flowers, an actual bouquet from the grocery store, wrapped in that crinkly cellophane that means someone planned ahead. When I passed my test 3 years later, I took the bus there alone and walked 2 blocks to a pizza place afterward, and sat in a corner booth and ate a personal pan by myself, because I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and it was already 4 in the afternoon, and I wasn't ready to go home yet. That was it. That was the entire celebration. When my sister went to college, my parents attended every orientation event. They bought her a new comforter, matching towels, a small refrigerator in the color she wanted. They made 4 separate trips to move her in. When I started at the state school 40 minutes from home, I borrowed my uncle's pickup truck, and my mother pressed a check into my hand at the front door. $400 for books, she said. That was my entire supplemental budget. I stocked shelves at a grocery store Friday nights and Saturday mornings for 3 straight years to fill the rest of the gap. I'm not telling this to assign blame. I'm telling it because context matters. Because the arithmetic of a childhood shapes what you expect from the people who are supposed to love you. Vesper understood all of this before I fully articulated it to myself. We met at work. I manage patient intake for a regional hospital network. She runs the billing department 1 floor below. And we started eating lunch together in the 2nd week because the break room was too loud, and we both liked the bench near the loading dock where the afternoon light came in sideways. Quiet people recognize each other. She asked me once, maybe 8 months into our friendship, why I always brought lunch from home. I told her it was a habit from leaner years. She nodded and didn't follow up, and that was when I knew she was someone I could keep. I told her about my sister the way you do, when you're not entirely sure how much of your own history is worth saying aloud, the college fund. The birthday dinners that were always elaborate for one of us and quiet for the other. My sister's wedding, which my parents spent 18 months planning, and which cost more than my entire first year of salary combined. My own college graduation, which fell on the same weekend as my niece's first birthday party, a party my parents had booked a venue for months in advance, and which they missed. Couldn't reschedule the venue, my mother explained. You understand. I crossed the stage in a gymnasium full of strangers in a dress I'd borrowed from a classmate, and called home from the parking lot. My mother picked up between placing a food order for the party and reminded me to get pictures before I left. Vesper listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you think they know what they're doing to you?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I think they believe love is finite," I said, "and they already spent most of it before I got old enough to need it." I had built my life carefully and without witnesses. A 1-bedroom apartment I'd turned into something worth coming home to. Plants on the sill, a real mattress, a small desk by the window, where I stood for the certifications that eventually got me promoted twice in 4 years. I had 6 months of expenses in savings. I had started maxing my 401k at 26 because a coworker once told me that compound interest was the only kind of patience that reliably paid off. I did not talk about any of this at family dinners. I had learned early that visible success in my family mostly meant being asked to share it before it was fully yours. The text came on a Tuesday. My mother, family dinner Sunday. Important, no question mark, no ask, the grammar of a summons. When I walked in on Sunday, the living room was arranged like a negotiation. My parents in their usual chairs pulled a few feet forward from where they normally sat. My sister on the couch with my brother-in-law beside her, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Papers spread across the coffee table. Printed papers, which meant my mother had prepared. My brother-in-law's landscaping business had collapsed. The details came out in installments. A large contract that dissolved overnight, a lender who called in the loan ahead of schedule, a tax issue from 2 years prior that had quietly accrued penalties while no one dealt with it. Their house was 3 months behind. My niece's preschool had sent a final notice. There were other debts my mother's voice skimmed past quickly, but they landed anyway. My father cleared his throat. We've covered what we can. Your mother and I aren't in a position to do more. Then my mother looked at me. You're single, she said. You don't have children. Your expenses are manageable. It only makes sense for you to step in. She slid a sheet of paper across the table. I looked at it without touching it. An itemized list. 3 months of mortgage arrears, preschool back payments, a line labeled immediate debt consolidation that I understood referred to whatever my brother-in-law owed privately. The total at the bottom was $18,400. This is what we need you to cover, my mother said, as simply as that, as though she were asking me to pick something up on my way over. My sister looked at her lap. She said my name quietly, the way people say it when they're about to ask for something they already know they don't have the right to ask for. We really need you right now. The room felt very small. The clock on the mantel ticked. I had been listening to that clock since childhood, and it had never sounded so loud. I looked at the number. I looked at my parents. I looked at my sister, who had received a $12,000 wedding gift from our parents the year she married, whose house down payment had come partly from a loan that was never repaid and eventually stopped being mentioned in any room I was in. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I said, "Give me the weekend." My mother nodded as though the outcome was already written. My brother-in-law exhaled. My sister looked up with something like relief, settling into her expression, and I felt the distance between what she thought my answer would be and what it actually was, like a gap I hadn't yet decided how to cross. I drove home in the dark without music, just the highway and my own breathing. In my apartment, I made tea I didn't drink and sat at my desk and looked at the city. Vesper texted around 9, "How did it go?" I called her instead of typing. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a beat. "What do you actually want to do?" "I want to understand what I owe them," I said. Money-wise. Any-wise. That was the real question underneath all the other questions. Not whether I had $18,000. I knew my numbers. The question was what I actually owed the idea of a family I had on silently carrying, since I was old enough to understand that I was the second version of someone else's first priority. "You've been filling a cup that was never held out for you," Vesper said. "You kept pouring anyway. That's not love. That's something else." After we hung up, I stayed at my desk. I opened my laptop. Not my accounts, I already knew those, and I opened a blank document and I started writing. Not a plan, a record. I listed everything I had contributed to this family over the past 10 years, without being asked, without being thanked, without it ever being named for what it was. The groceries I brought to my parents' house every other week. The $400 I'd sent my sister when her car registration lapsed, and she texted that she didn't have it this month. The money I'd spent on my niece's birthday gifts, Christmas, Easter. My mother always let me know in advance what my niece was hoping for, framed as a helpful heads up, and I always came through. The afternoons I'd driven my father to medical appointments when my mother was busy with my sister's kids. The streaming subscriptions billed to my card that both my parents used without comment. Small things, consistent things. The quiet infrastructure of a family that had decided I was load-bearing without ever telling me what I was holding up. I added a column next to each item. Was this asked for, yes or no? By the time I stopped, the document was 4 pages. Most of the checks were in the no column. Things that had been expected, assumed, absorbed. Things that had simply appeared in my life as obligations the way some people's obligations appear and stay. I printed it, folded it once, set it on the corner of my desk. Then I opened my banking app. I removed my mother's login from the streaming account. I canceled the line add-on on my phone plan that covered my sister's second number. I had added it 3 years ago when she said she was between jobs, and I had never canceled it because no one ever brought it up again. Small leaks. The kind you stop noticing until you actually look at them all at once. Something lifted, not dramatically, just incrementally, the way a room feels slightly different after you open one window. I want to say plainly that part of me wanted to help them, because it's true, she was my sister, they were my parents. Whatever the years had been, I was not someone who felt nothing when people I loved were struggling. I knew that, and I held it. But I had learned the difference between love and leverage. What had been laid on that coffee table was not a request. It was an assignment, and I had been completing assignments alone since I was old enough to take the bus by myself. On Sunday morning, I drove back. Same living room. Same chairs. Pulled forward. My sister had brought a tray of coffee this time, a small gesture that might have meant she understood more than she showed. My mother looked at me with the settled calm of someone who had already reached the conclusion and was simply waiting for the formality to catch up. "We're glad you came back," she said. "We can sort through everything today." I set my bag on the coffee table. I took out 2 things, the folded document and a single business card. My mother's eyes went to them immediately. "I'm not going to cover the debt," I said. The room changed. My brother-in-law straightened. My mother's expression shifted. "What?" she said. "I'm not going to cover it," I said again, the same tone, no apology underneath it. "But I want to explain, and I want you to actually hear me." "You said you needed time to think," my father said carefully. I used it. I unfolded the document and placed it on the table. 4 pages, printed, dated. My mother leaned forward. My sister stared. "This is what I've contributed to this family over the past 10 years, I said. Financially, logistically, time. Not things that were asked for, things that were assumed. I wrote it down because I needed to see it for myself, and I think you need to see it too before anyone in this room tells me what I should do next." My mother's voice thinned. "You kept a record of family things." Someone had to. Silence settled completely over the room. The business card is for a financial counselor who works with families in exactly this kind of situation. I've already paid for the first session. I slid it across the table toward my sister. That's what I'm offering. Professional help. Paid for by me as a gift, not a loan. But the $18,000 that I'm not giving. "You have it," my mother said. "It wasn't a question." "Whether I have it isn't the point," I said. "The point is that this isn't how a family is supposed to work. Last week you told me my sister's family has to come first, that I always have more room to give. I waited a beat. That was the most honest thing you've ever said to me, and I want you to know I heard every word of it." My mother looked at the window. "I've had more room my entire life because you kept me at the edge of everything," I said. "The edge of celebrations, the edge of family decisions, the edge of every photo, every check, every conversation about the future. I stopped asking why a long time ago. But I'm not going to stand at the edge of my own bank account while you assign it to someone else's emergency." My brother-in-law said, "I cannot believe you're doing this. You'd let us lose the house." You're not losing the house because of me, I said, and I kept my voice even. You're in this situation because of decisions made long before I walked into this room. I'm sorry that's true, but it is true. She's your sister, my mother said. She is. I love her. I looked at my sister directly for the first time since I'd sat down. Her eyes were wet. She held her hands very still in her lap. But love isn't the same as liability. I am not responsible for a debt I didn't create, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise because it would be easier for everyone in this room. I stood. I picked up my bag. My father was still looking at the document. He turned one page over carefully, the way he used to turn the pages of books when I was small, before that became part of the evening routine he reserved for a different child. He didn't look up. I walked to the door. My mother's voice followed me. So that's it. You walk out. I turned one last time. You told me I always have more room to give, I said. You were right. I just didn't understand until now what that room was actually mine to use. I closed the door quietly behind me. 4 months passed. My sister's family moved to a smaller rental 2 towns over. It was a hard season for them, and I didn't pretend it wasn't. I knew the outline of what was happening the way you know things in a family, even when direct communication has gone quiet. Through peripheral updates, through the things people mention without meaning to. My niece had started at the public school. My mother drove over twice a week to help. My brother-in-law had picked up contract work. The financial counselor's name surfaced in a conversation my mother accidentally referenced months later. Things changed slowly. Real things always do. My phone rang on a Wednesday evening in late February. My mother. I let it ring twice before I answered. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. She was not built for the kind of apology that requires taking apart a structure you've lived inside for decades. But she was quieter than usual. She asked how I was. She asked about work. She mentioned she'd driven past a restaurant near my neighborhood that she thought I might like. You've been over here? I said. Once. An errand nearby. A pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. I didn't knock. I didn't know if you'd want me to. I sat with that for a moment. You could have knocked, I said. She came on a Saturday in March. The first time inside my apartment, though I'd lived there 4 years. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she stepped in, looking at the plants on the windowsill, the art print above the bookshelf, the small desk by the window where I had, in the dark and quiet of various nights, made most of the decisions that had built this life one careful choice at a time. You've done really well, she said. The words were not enough. They were nowhere near enough for what had accumulated over 30 years. But they were the first time she had ever looked at what I'd made and said its name out loud. I know, I said, and I handed her a cup of coffee. We sat at the kitchen table for an hour and a half, more honestly than we had in years. She didn't confess anything. I didn't indict her. We talked around the edges of what was true the way people do when the truth is large, and they are still learning to stand close to it without looking away. But she stayed. She finished the whole coffee. She looked at my bookshelves on the way out. You were always reading, she said, almost to herself. You stopped noticing, I said, gently, plainly, without cruelty. She paused at the door. She nodded once, slowly, and then she left. Vesper asked that same evening how it had gone. We were on my couch, takeout containers between us. The window cracked just enough to let the evening air move through the room. Strange, I said. Not bad, just strange. Does strange feel okay? I thought about it. It feels like the beginning of something I don't have a word for yet. She stole a dumpling. That's enough. It was. Not a resolution. Not an absolution. Not the kind of ending where everything that happened before it gets rewritten into something it wasn't. Just the beginning of something that was, for the first time in as long as I could remember, moving toward me instead of past me. My niece calls me sometimes now, on her own from my sister's phone, the way children reach out when no one has told them yet that it might be complicated. She tells me things about school, loose, colorful, unhurried things. I listen, I ask questions. I'm learning her the way I should have been given the chance to all along. My sister and I haven't had the real conversation yet. Maybe we will, when she's ready to hold it. I've stopped timing other people's readiness against my own. I've learned to build in the space where the waiting used to be. The document is still in a desk drawer, not as a weapon. Not even as a reminder, exactly. Just because it exists, because I wrote it, because it took 30 years before I ever sat down and put what was owed to me on paper and looked at it directly in the light. And I want to hold on to what that night felt like. The desk, the city, the slow, particular act of finally taking up the space I had always been told, one way or another, that I was taking up anyway. My mother said I always had more room to give. She was right, I did. It just turned out the room was mine.